Imagine traveling hundreds of miles, clutching a letter filled with promises of love, only to be rejected the moment your true identity is revealed. That's exactly what happened to Sarah Thompson in 1885, a young, educated African-American teacher who dared to believe in love, but instead uncovered a secret that would shake an entire town to its core. What began as heartbreak on a train platform would soon ignite a fight for justice, truth, and legacy that no one in Millbrook, Ohio, would ever forget. Picture this for a moment. You're standing on a train platform, your heart beating so fast you can barely breathe. In your hands, you're clutching a letter that's been read so many times the edges are soft and worn. After 3 long weeks of travel, bouncing from train to train, sleeping in uncomfortable seats, and eating nothing but bread and cheese, you've finally arrived. You've spent every penny you had saved, packed all your hopes into a single trunk, and traveled hundreds of miles to meet the man who promised to love you forever. This was Sarah Thompson's reality on that fateful day in 1885, as she stepped off the train in Millbrook, Ohio. Sarah wasn't just any woman traveling alone. She was an educated, intelligent African-American teacher from Chicago, seeking a fresh start in a place where she hoped the color of her skin wouldn't determine her worth. For 6 long months, she had exchanged passionate letters with Robert Mitchell, a merchant who claimed to be a lonely widower seeking true companionship. In those letters, Robert had written beautiful words about longing for someone who could understand his heart, someone educated and kind who could share his dreams of building a life together. Sarah had found herself falling for the man behind those words, the way he described watching sunsets alone and wishing for someone special to share them with. He wrote about books he loved, about his hope for a peaceful life filled with meaningful conversation and genuine partnership. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Robert had never once asked about her race. And she had never thought to mention it. Why would she? In her mind, love was about the meeting of hearts and minds, not the color of skin. She had been heartbroken too many times in Chicago by men who saw her as less than human because of her heritage. Robert's letters had felt different, pure, focused on what really mattered. So there she stood on that platform, wearing her finest dress, a deep blue gown she had saved for months to buy. On her head sat a delicate hat with small flowers, purchased specifically for this moment when she would meet her future husband. Her trunk contained not just clothes, but carefully chosen books, a few precious family photographs, and hidden beneath a false bottom, documents she had inherited from her grandfather, Thomas Freeman. Documents she barely understood but knew were important enough for her grandfather to risk his life protecting them. Sarah scanned the platform, searching for the man Robert had described in his familiar handwriting. Her heart leaped when she spotted a man matching that description, holding a bouquet of fresh flowers and looking around nervously. "Excuse me," she called softly, approaching with a gentle smile. "Are you Robert Mitchell?" The man turned toward her, and in that single moment, Sarah's world shattered into 1,000 pieces. Robert's face went from hopeful anticipation to shock, then to unmistakable disgust, all in the space of a heartbeat. The color drained from his skin as if he had seen a ghost in broad daylight. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and the beautiful bouquet in his hands began to tremble. You're Sarah Thompson," he stammered, taking an instinctive step backward. "This isn't going to work." Sarah felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach. She had experienced rejection before, but never quite like this. Never so immediate, so visceral, so public. Other passengers were beginning to stare, sensing drama unfolding. "You didn't mention that you were." Robert's voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "That I was black," Sarah completed quietly, her chin lifting with dignity even as her heart broke. "No, Mr. Mitchell. I didn't mention that. Just like you never asked." Robert's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. "In your letters, you wrote so well. I imagined. I thought." He took another step back, the bouquet now wilting visibly in his sweaty grip. "Couldn't you have warned me?" The words hit Sarah like physical blows. Warned him? As if her very existence was some kind of threat or deception. "Tell you what, exactly?" Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "That my skin is as dark as night, but my feelings are as real as yours. That my heart can break just like anyone else's. You never asked about my race, Mr. Mitchell. In 6 months of letters, you never once inquired." Robert glanced around nervously, noticing the growing crowd of curious onlookers. In a small town like Millbrook, a well-dressed black woman was already unusual enough to attract attention. A black woman being publicly rejected by a white man? That was irresistible entertainment. "You have to understand my position," Robert muttered, his voice getting smaller. "The community here, my business, what would people think?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out some crumpled bills, holding them towards Sarah like she was some kind of beggar. "I can pay for your ticket back to Chicago. You seem educated. I'm sure you'll understand. This just won't work." Sarah stared at the money, then back at Robert's face. In that moment, she saw him clearly for the first time. Not the romantic figure from the letters, but a small, frightened man who cared more about what his neighbors might think than about the feelings of another human being. "I spent all my savings to get here," she said, her voice carrying across the platform despite its quietness. "I have nowhere to go back to." That's when everything changed. A deep voice cut through the tension like thunder on a clear day. "Is that your solution, Mitchell? Throw money at the problem and hope it goes away, like it always does?" Sarah turned to see a tall man approaching, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was dressed simply but expensively, the kind of clothes that spoke of real wealth, not the flashy display of those trying to impress. His face was tanned from a life spent outdoors, but his eyes held an intelligence and authority that made even the gathering crowd step back respectfully. "This is none of your concern, Crawford," Robert replied, but his voice betrayed his nervousness. "It becomes my concern when I watch a man I've known for 15 years behave like a coward," the newcomer replied coolly. He turned to Sarah, and she was surprised to see his gaze soften with genuine kindness. "Miss, allow me to introduce myself. James Crawford. I own the large farm just outside town." Sarah nodded carefully, her experience making her suspicious of kindness from strangers, especially wealthy white strangers. Too often, such kindness came with strings attached, or worse. "If I may be so bold," James continued, "I'd like to offer you lodging at my home until you can decide what you'd like to do next. We have guest rooms that rarely see use, and my housekeeper would welcome the company." Robert's face went from pale to bright red. "Crawford, you can't be serious. What will people say?" James smiled, but it was the kind of cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. The kind of smile that held barely contained power. "The same people who do business with me every day, Mitchell. The same people who buy their goods from suppliers I recommend. The same people whose farms depend on the water rights I control." His voice remained pleasant, but the message was crystal clear. "I'm very curious to hear what they would say." Robert's mouth snapped shut. Everyone on that platform understood what had just happened. James Crawford wasn't just any wealthy farmer. He was the wealthy farmer, the man whose land and business connections kept half the town employed. His opinion carried more weight than social conventions, and everyone knew it. But Sarah was looking beyond the power play between the two men. She was studying James Crawford's face, trying to understand this unexpected intervention. Why would a wealthy white man involve himself in her humiliation? What did he want from her? "Miss Thompson," James said, turning his full attention back to her, "I realize you have no reason to trust a stranger, especially after this display. But I give you my word as a gentleman that you would be completely safe in my home. My housekeeper, Mrs. Henderson, runs the household, and she would ensure your comfort and privacy." Sarah looked from James to Robert, then to the crowd of onlookers who were drinking in every word of this unexpected drama. She thought of her empty purse, her lack of options, and the long journey that had brought her to this moment. More importantly, she thought of the documents hidden in her trunk. Documents that her grandfather Thomas Freeman had protected with his life. Documents that she was only beginning to understand might hold secrets about this very town. "Mr. Crawford," she said finally, her voice clear and dignified, "I accept your kind offer." Robert Mitchell's face crumpled in defeat and barely contained rage. "This is madness, Crawford. The whole town will be talking." "Let them talk," James replied simply. Then he offered Sarah his arm with the same courtesy he would show any lady. "Shall we, Miss Thompson?" As Sarah placed her hand on James Crawford's arm and walked toward his waiting carriage, she had no idea that this moment of unexpected kindness would lead to discoveries that would shake Millbrook to its very foundations. She couldn't know that the documents in her trunk would prove that this entire town, including Robert Mitchell's precious store, was built on land that rightfully belonged to her family. She couldn't know that the man who had just rejected her based on the color of her skin had unknowingly set in motion events that would cost him everything he held dear. All Sarah knew in that moment was that sometimes, when one door slams shut in your face, the universe has a way of opening another one. And sometimes, just sometimes, that new door leads to justice that's been waiting over a century to finally be served. The carriage pulled away from the station, carrying Sarah toward a future she couldn't imagine, while Robert Mitchell stood alone on the platform, still holding a bouquet of dying flowers, having no idea that his act of cruel rejection had just cost him far more than he could ever comprehend. Now, if you thought the story ended with Sarah finding sanctuary at James Crawford's estate, you'd be wrong. Because what happened next would prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice isn't anger or revenge, it's truth. And Sarah Thompson was about to uncover a truth so explosive it would change not just her life, but the entire foundation of Millbrook, Ohio. The Crawford estate wasn't just a farm, as James had modestly called it. When Sarah's carriage passed through the ornate iron gates, she found herself looking at a magnificent Victorian mansion that could have graced the pages of any fancy magazine. Sprawling gardens, perfectly manicured lawns, and in the distance, fields that seemed to stretch on forever. This wasn't just wealth, this was power, the kind that shaped communities and influenced lives. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, greeted Sarah with professional warmth. If she was surprised to see a black woman as a guest in the Crawford home, she didn't show it. Instead, she led Sarah to a beautiful blue bedroom with tall windows overlooking the garden, treating her with the same respect she would show any honored guest. That evening, over dinner in the grand dining room, James shared his story. His father had been a banker from the North, his mother a teacher who had strongly supported the abolition of slavery. When James inherited both fortune and progressive values, he chose to move to Millbrook 15 years earlier, despite being viewed as an eccentric outsider by the traditional community. "They couldn't ostracize me completely," James explained with a slight smile. "Too much of their prosperity depends on my land and business connections. But they've never quite accepted me either." Sarah shared her own story carefully, how she had been a literature and history teacher at a school for girls of color in Chicago, how the school's closure had forced her to seek a new beginning. But she kept her most important secret to herself: the real reason she had come to Ohio, and the documents hidden in her trunk. You see, Sarah's grandfather, Thomas Freeman, had been more than just a butler to a wealthy family. He had been a careful observer, a meticulous record keeper, and a man who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapons are made of paper and ink. Before his death, he had passed these documents to Sarah, along with a story that seemed almost too incredible to believe. According to her grandfather, their family had once owned vast amounts of land in this very region, land that had been stolen, along with their dignity and their future. But Thomas Freeman had never forgotten, and more importantly, he had never stopped collecting evidence. In the days following her arrival, Sarah spent hours in James's extensive library. When he asked about her research, she simply said she was broadening her horizons. What she was actually doing was far more specific. Among the dusty books and yellowed documents, she was piecing together a puzzle that had been scattered across decades. Word of Sarah's presence spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Suddenly, the Crawford estate saw a parade of unexpected visitors, curious neighbors, merchants' wives, even the local minister, all finding urgent reasons to call on James. Sarah had become the town's most intriguing mystery, though she hadn't even set foot in the town proper. After a week, Robert Mitchell finally worked up the courage to visit. He arrived unannounced, hat literally in hand, claiming concern for Sarah's situation. "It's not proper," he stammered, "for an unmarried woman of her background to be staying in the home of an unmarried man. The church committee is organizing a collection to help her return to Chicago." That's when Sarah delivered a blow that Robert never saw coming. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell," she said with calm dignity, "my plans have changed. Mr. Crawford has kindly offered me the position of librarian here on the estate. Apparently, generations of Crawfords have collected books without ever properly organizing them." Robert's face went pale. "You can't be serious." "I've never been more serious," James replied smoothly. "Miss Thompson is highly educated and competent. My library has never been in better hands." What Robert didn't understand, what no one could have guessed, was the true significance of Sarah's new position. As librarian, She now had legitimate access to every document, every record, every piece of paper that told the history of Millbrook and the surrounding region, including records that certain families had tried very hard to hide. Late at night, by lamplight, Sarah worked her way through decades of documents. Land deeds, legal filings, correspondence between families, records of meetings and decisions that shaped the town. And slowly, piece by piece, a shocking picture began to emerge. In 1866, just after the Civil War ended, a freed slave named Thomas Freeman, Sarah's great-grandfather, had been granted extensive land holdings by the state governor. This wasn't charity or kindness. Thomas Freeman had earned this land through years of service and had been legally recognized as its rightful owner. The land constituted approximately 60% of what would become modern Millbrook. But in 1870, something terrible happened. Local white residents, angered by Thomas Freeman's success and unwilling to accept a black man as a major landowner, began threatening him. There were attempted lynchings, burned crops, and finally, Freeman was forced to flee for his life, leaving everything behind. Within months, the town's founding families, including the Mitchells, had divided Freeman's abandoned land among themselves. They formed what they called the Millbrook Development Committee to make their theft look official and legal. They destroyed records, altered documents, and over the decades, convinced themselves and everyone else that Thomas Freeman had never existed at all. But they had missed something. James Crawford's library contained copies of regional records that couldn't be altered or destroyed. Cross-references that proved the conspiracy. Evidence that had been sitting there for decades, waiting for someone who knew what to look for. 2 weeks after her arrival, Sarah knew she had everything she needed. The truth was finally ready to see the light. The emergency town hall meeting was Robert Mitchell's idea. Standing before a packed room, his face red with indignation, he gestured wildly as he spoke. "This is an outrage," he declared to the assembled crowd. "Crawford is openly defying our community's values by harboring that woman. Decent families are concerned about rumors of inappropriate behavior." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. These people had convinced themselves they were protecting their town's moral fiber. They had no idea they were about to learn some uncomfortable truths about their own moral foundations. That's when the doors opened, and James Crawford entered calmly, followed by Sarah Thompson, who walked with the dignity of royalty. The room fell silent as they made their way to the front. "I appreciate the invitation," James said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "Although I must correct a misunderstanding. Miss Thompson isn't here as my guest, but as the legal representative of a matter that concerns all of you." Robert laughed nervously. "Legal representative? A woman of color with no education or authority? Crawford, have you lost your mind?" Sarah opened her briefcase with methodical precision. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, in addition to being a certified teacher with a college degree, I have legal power of attorney as the direct descendant of Thomas Freeman." The name hit the room like a lightning bolt. The older faces in the crowd went pale as buried memories suddenly surfaced. "Thomas Freeman doesn't exist," Robert retorted quickly, but his voice was trembling. "He's just an old story, an urban legend." "How curious," Sarah replied, removing yellowed documents from her briefcase. "Because I have here the original land deeds signed by the state governor in 1866, granting Thomas Freeman, my great-grandfather, legal ownership of the land that today constitutes approximately 60% of Millbrook, including, Mr. Mitchell, the land where your store currently stands." Judge Patterson, a respected elderly man, adjusted his spectacles and examined the documents Sarah presented. These appear to be authentic." "They are forgeries," Robert shouted, but his protest sounded hollow even to himself. "The supporting records are all here," Sarah continued, unperturbed by his outburst, "including detailed accounts of how Thomas Freeman was forced to flee after attempted lynchings in 1870, and how the founding families subsequently divided his legally owned land among themselves." That's when James spoke up. "The Crawford Library has maintained copies of all regional land records for decades. Interestingly, the specific records from 1870 to 1872 had been mysteriously missing from the town's official files, until Miss Thompson found cross-references in other documents that proved what really happened. At that precise moment, the hall doors opened again, and Attorney Reynolds from the state capitol entered with news that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced in a clear, professional voice, I have just come from the State Historical Records Commission. The documents presented by Miss Thompson have been thoroughly verified by experts. They are authentic. Furthermore, I am here to inform you that a formal lawsuit has been filed to address this historical injustice. The hall erupted into chaos. Angry voices, panic, people shouting over each other as the implications sank in. In the midst of this turmoil, Robert Mitchell lunged towards Sarah, his face twisted with rage. "You planned this from the beginning," he hissed. "This is what you were hiding in your letters." Sarah looked at him with calm dignity, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "No, Mr. Mitchell. In those letters, I was simply a lonely woman seeking companionship and a fresh start. It was your immediate rejection of me, based solely on the color of my skin, that made me realize what kind of man you truly were. The same kind of man who would have driven my great-grandfather from his rightful land for the exact same reason you rejected me." But then Sarah said something that surprised everyone in that room, including Robert Mitchell. "However, I'm not here seeking revenge. I'm proposing something different." The room gradually quieted as people strained to hear her words. "I propose the creation of the Freeman Foundation, a community organization that will benefit all citizens of Millbrook, with special focus on education and affordable housing. The goal isn't to punish the descendants for their ancestors' actions, but to right a historical wrong in a way that helps everyone." James Crawford looked at her with undisguised admiration. "You could have demanded everything," he whispered, "and become just like those who stole from my great-grandfather." Sarah replied softly, "Justice isn't about revenge, James. It's about restoration." 6 months later, Millbrook, Ohio was a completely transformed town. The Freeman Foundation, funded by the legal settlement, had already established scholarships for disadvantaged students and was funding community improvement projects throughout the region. Robert Mitchell's former store now housed Millbrook's first public library, a beautiful irony where stories that had been buried could finally be told. Robert himself had left town weeks after the revelation, selling his remaining properties for far less than their value. Word was he now worked as a clerk in a distant town, his pride as diminished as his bank account. Sarah, now married to James Crawford and bearing the name Sarah Crawford, had become not a symbol of vengeance, but of vision. The Crawford estate had been partially converted into a cultural center, and the main house officially renamed Freeman Crawford House, honoring both families' contributions to the community's healing. News of the Freeman heiress spread far beyond Ohio, attracting journalists and historians documenting similar cases of historical land theft across America. Sarah received invitations to speak at universities, sharing not just her personal story but the legal methods she had used to reclaim justice. During a celebration dinner at Freeman Crawford House, Judge Patterson raised an unexpected toast. "To the woman who taught us that justice is not merely a legal concept, but a daily practice." When Sarah arrived in our community, we thought we knew who she was based solely on her appearance. What a humbling and necessary lesson we all learned. In Millbrook's town square, where once only traditional white families had been celebrated, a new bronze plaque now told the story of Thomas Freeman and how his unjustly taken land had finally been returned to serve the entire community. The monument stood not as a symbol of division, but of healing and the possibility of redemption through truth. As Sarah stood on her porch each evening, watching the lights of Millbrook twinkle in the distance, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her there. She had arrived as a rejected stranger, deemed unworthy of love or belonging because of her race. She was now not only accepted but respected, not for conforming to others' expectations, but for standing firm in her principles and choosing restoration over revenge. The lesson Millbrook learned that year echoed through generations. When we judge others based on superficial characteristics, we don't just deny their humanity, we blind ourselves to the extraordinary value they might bring to our lives. Robert Mitchell's cruel rejection, intended to humiliate and diminish Sarah, had instead become the catalyst for her to discover her true power and purpose. His prejudice, meant to preserve an unjust status quo, had ultimately led to the very justice and equality he had tried to prevent. In the end, Sarah Thompson Crawford's greatest triumph wasn't about punishing those who had wronged her family. It was about building something so beautiful, fair, and lasting that their initial rejection became nothing more than a small footnote in a much larger story. A story about the transformative power of choosing love over hatred, even when faced with the deepest injustice. And perhaps most importantly, it was a story that proved something Sarah had always known in her heart. That our differences aren't obstacles to overcome, but sources of strength that can transform entire communities, if only we're brave enough to see past the surface and recognize the human heart that beats within us all. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from fighting our enemies, but from refusing to become like them. And sometimes, just sometimes, the person who rejects us for who we are ends up giving us exactly what we need to become who we're meant to be.